Welcome. My name is Bill Brennan. I'm a member of Illuman, which is an international men's group seeded by Father Richard Rohr about 25 years ago. And we're here to welcome Bill Plotkin. Bill, I want to thank you for being here. You're being with us. You're being with us tonight is at this crucial time for all species on our planet that we share, Mother Earth, is really important. And I also want to thank Illuman for hosting this whole event, and to all the men that have showed up here tonight, and probably some women too. And we're grateful for the support and inspiration your presence brings us. And I also want to welcome the men that are going to be watching us on video in the future. For those of you who just happen to show up here and don't know who Bill Plotkin is, he's an eco-psychologist, he's an eco-depth psychologist, and he's the author of 3 books: Soulcraft, Nature and the Human Soul, and Wild Mind. And now we're going to be talking about a new book he's just written that was just published this month, The Journey of Soul Initiation. And this is the culmination of Bill's work for the last 40 years, his magnum opus, taking men and women out into the wilderness, out into the wilds of the West for experiences in the wilderness. He's researched it, he's studied it, he's lived it, and he's going to share with us his wisdom over 40 years. A pretty unique vantage point, I think. We're going to begin with a few minutes of silence, just to help us release any and all tensions that we carry with us into this time. And to do that, I give you my co-host, Mr. Anthony Monticchio, my buddy.
Yeah, welcome, guys. All right, so we're going to start, Bill, in typical Illuman style. So I've been involved with youth formation for several years now. And one of the first lessons we teach confirmation candidates is how to center oneself and reconnect with life itself. We offer 3 ways: nature, which Bill will be very familiar with, music, and silence. We'll start tonight with all 3. I'm going to share an image of the oldest trees sharing life with us in this more than human world we co-inhabit. I'll read a quote from Chief Luther Standing Bear from the Teton Sioux people. That will lead us into 2 minutes of solo drumming, followed by a quote from Albert Einstein. Then we'll have 1 minute of silence. When the sound of the singing bowl rings, that will bring us back together and we'll get started. So I'll share my screen now. From Wankantanka, the Great Spirit, there came a great unifying life force that flowed in and through all things. The flowers of the plains, the blowing winds, the rocks, the trees, the birds, the animals. And it was the same force that had been breathed into the first man. Thus all things were kindred and were brought together by the same great mystery. You guys can hear that, right? A human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Our plan for tonight's gathering will be to follow the theme from this week's CAC Morning Reflections on the Cosmic Egg. We'll ask Bill a series of questions, starting with my story, personal questions and how the joy of soul initiation can help me personally and you. Then we'll move to our story and dive deeper into what the book can offer for humanity as a whole. And last, we'll touch on the story, on how nature can offer us a transcending experience. If time remains, we'll have a few questions and responses before we close our gathering. So we'll get started, and Bill will get us started with the first question. Thanks.
Bill, how did you get into this work in the first place?
Okay, I'm laughing a little bit because it would be hard to identify anything that wasn't an influence. I think that is true of people who have found what I would call their soul work, that everything that's happened for them has ushered them in that direction. But I hope I can give you actually a more interesting answer to that one. So, like I believe all children, I wondered, I had a lot of questions, and sometimes I asked others, and mostly I didn't. But I wondered about, what is this thing to be human, and what is life really about, and why was I born to these particular parents in this town, and where was I before I was born, and what is death, and etc. These basic questions about meaning and orientation to life. And my belief is that every child naturally wonders those things. And in contemporary cultures like ours, that wondering tends to be suppressed after a while. And a lot of people might not even remember having wondered those things, but I bet most people, like our listeners tonight, can remember wondering about those things. Like a lot of people, I was brought up in a family with a kind of a conservative religious orientation. In my family's case, it was Judaism. But my parents weren't particularly religious, and the religious school that I went to, the Hebrew school, was pretty conservative and unimaginative, which is probably true of many such religious training school systems. And maybe that's starting to change, I don't know. But I found that none of my questions were even touched by 6 years of training in Judaism. And so my conclusion actually was not that the world really isn't as mysterious as I intuited, but that my people just didn't have a clue about how to access those realms. That's how conclusion I came to. But I pretty much kept this stuff to myself because I didn't really know anybody who would even talk about these things. Another thing that really helped me a lot, and I think saved my life, my spiritual life, was the fact that I'm very introverted. I ended up spending a lot of my time as a child in the woods, in the forest. I lived in a suburb of Boston, but we were right on the edge of pretty extensive forest. And I spent a lot of my time in the wild, either alone or with one particular friend. And so that kept my wonder about the world and life alive. And now I know, many years later, that that's one of the most essential things for a child in any culture, in order to keep our innate wonder about the more than human world alive. And we all know that that's becoming increasingly challenging for children these days, and at least in where we live, and I mean, in the Western world, and for the parents of children to allow their kids that opportunity. So when I got to college, I started having access to other spiritual systems that seemed to have at least something mystical still alive. And they were mostly Eastern oriented spiritualities, like first Zen Buddhism, and then various yogas, Kundalini yoga in particular, Sufism, and so on. And this continued through into grad school as well. And these other mystical traditions helped a lot, but I still felt there was something missing, something juicy and earthy, something that was more about the individual mysteries and not just the universal one-size-fits-all kind of mysteries. Another major piece for me was early experiences with psychedelics, which maybe now many people call entheogenic journeys. And in my early 20s and after, but especially in my early 20s, that really gave me a deep experiential grounding that the world is way more mysterious and mystical than I even suspected, and that my culture, my people ever would talk about. And that was a major stimulus in my development. And let's see, the last thing I guess, no, maybe it's a couple things, but one I want to make sure I mention here is that it's not just a matter of experiences that got me into this work, it's also the soul. That I was born as someone who was destined in some ways to do the explorations that I did. That's true for everybody. Everybody is being ushered in a certain way by their soul. So we can say, yeah, that I had the good fortune to be able to listen to those intuitions, and that made all the difference. I'll say again that time in wilderness got me wondering about our collective and individual place in the more than human world, the greater Earth community. And then in my 20s also, I had some exposure to native indigenous traditions, and I was noticing, okay, they've got something that it seems completely missing in our contemporary Western world, including our spiritualities. So, okay, I could go on, but I'll stop there. Those are some of the early experiences that got me wondering about. Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned a couple times something missing. What did you seem to perceive was missing in familiar psychology and spirituality?
Yeah, something about a couple of things. One is our relationship to the other than human world, the greater world that we emerged from as a species and that we emerge individually from through our mothers, our human mothers. So that was missing in most of the spiritualities in most ways, yeah, that I studied and practiced in my earlier years. And then something about the individual mysteries. So in reference to something you mentioned earlier about these three stories that Richard has beautifully been writing about recently, I want to offer an amendment and say there's actually two kinds of my story. And I believe Richard left out what to me is the most important of the two my stories. There's the ego my story. And by ego, I don't mean a bad thing. I just mean the part of us that's conscious of ourselves. Sometimes we call at Animus Valley Institute, we call this the middle world story. Who am I socially or vocationally, or my religious faith and so forth? So that's part of my story. But the deeper my story, sometimes in some traditions, it's called the underworld story, or I would say the soul-oriented story, is a completely different story, but it's still my story. It's something that is uniquely mine, but is way deeper than personality, deeper than anything that could be defined in social or vocational or religious terms. And that deeper story, that nature-based deeper story, to put those two strands together, that was missing completely. And when I look around in the contemporary world today, it's still mostly those two strands are almost entirely missing, although we're getting the nature connection piece of it beautifully from so many organizations. People are getting tuned into that part. But the individual mysteries of what I would call the soul, I have a different definition than most people, those mysteries almost completely absent still.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Bill, that cues us right up for the first part, which was Richard's my story. So we were going to break this up into three: my story, our story, the story.
Yeah.
So we'll start the my story piece. So you write that the majority of people alive today, those over the age of 12, are stuck in adolescence. What do you mean by this? How did this happen, and what can be done about it?
Thanks for that question. It's that's a really big one. And my answer is both, it'd be probably disturbing to most people, but maybe a kind of liberating for a lot of people too. If we take the implications seriously, it's really a profound critique of contemporary cultures, what some people call industrial growth societies. I call them conformist consumer societies like ours. So stuck in adolescence, first of all, by adolescence, I don't mean our teen years. I mean a psychological stage of life that for most people does in fact start around age 11, 12, 13. But for contemporary people, I believe maybe 80%, that's a very rough percentage, maybe more, never get past adolescence in their development. It's because of how our culture actually suppresses human development. So, but it's more complicated than that because there's actually I understand there to be two very different stages of adolescence. And what I believe is that most contemporary humans get stuck in the first of those, early adolescence. And brace yourself, it's even worse than that there's two forms of early adolescence. One is healthy, which I would call ecocentric, nature-oriented. And the other one is not so healthy. It's even pathological or egocentric, as if, life is all about just me, the middle world superficial ego story. So yeah, to get past early adolescence, there seems to be there's a requirement that we are supported as children by our parents, educational systems, the community at large, more generally, to unfold the flower of our natural human nature. And there's so many ways that is actually obstructed and suppressed. And you won't be surprised I could go on for hours about that alone. It's that material is in my book, Nature and the Human Soul, which is a nature-based developmental wheel, 8 stages. It's very, very unlike anything in Western psychology, because most of Western psychology really is talking about developmental models, doesn't get us past the first 3 stages of this model. So it's quite different. So maybe you'd want me to look into a particular aspect of that if you'd have other questions there, or maybe you'd like us to move on if that's enough of a foundation.
Yeah, I think that's probably enough to get us started. The next one actually takes us probably in a little different direction,
Right.
but it's still focused on, I guess, my story. You write, as many others also have, that true elders are very rare in the world today. But you go further. You say that true adults are also rare. What do you mean by a true adult, and why have they become so uncommon?
Yeah, again, disturbing conclusion I've had to come to, and a radical one. So yeah, a true adult. There's so many ways to get into that. One way is to say that I use a phrase that picks up a lot of the implications of how I understand a true adult. And that phrase is a visionary artisan of cultural evolution. Or when we live in a unhealthy, even we could say pathological culture like the contemporary Western world, we'd say a visionary artisan of cultural renaissance or cultural regeneration, because that's what we're looking at now, is regeneration, regenerating a healthy culture. So here's a slightly longer definition of adult. It's a person who experiences their primary membership as being in the more than human world. Okay, so let's just pause there a second. A true adult doesn't identify primarily in terms of their religion or their career or their religious faith or their ethnicity or their social circle. These are all beautiful aspects of anybody's individual identity. And a true adult is proud of all of these pieces. But a true adult experiences themselves primarily as a member in a flourishing world of thousands and thousands of species, as a member of this greater Earth community. That's part one. And second, a true adult is someone who's had one or more visions or revelations or mystical experiences that has revealed for them their unique place in the Earth community, not in the human village, but in the Earth community. And third, that true adult is someone who has found one or more ways to embody that unique place that they were born to take in the greater Earth community as a gift to not only their people, but to the whole web of life. So you might say it's a mystical definition of adulthood, but I believe in any healthy culture, it wouldn't be called mysticism. It would be called a normal, everyday understanding of what it is to be a human, that we're born with this knowledge of what we are to do in life. But the knowledge is not that we're born with is not in cultural terms. It's not even in linguistic terms. It's not something that could be defined in terms of a social role or a job or a career or a creative project. It's defined in terms of our place in the greater Earth community. And this gets us to what I mean, what my actual definition of soul is, which seems radical to people at first. But I believe when people really sink into it, it's kind of like obvious. And that is, by soul, I mean a thing's unique ecological niche, the unique place that a thing was born, was created to take in this world. For us humans, again, it's the same thing. We each have a unique ecological niche. And an adult is someone who has discovered what that is through initiatory journey, which I call the journey of soul initiation, hence the title of the new book. And that adult that's what they're doing. In their mind, that's what an adult is doing, regardless of what job they have, or even if they don't have a job, and regardless of what social role they have. In their mind, an adult is delivering this or embodying this mystical relationship to the larger Earth community.
Bill, what do you mean when you say in your book, a mythopoetic identity?
Oh, good. Yeah, that's the perfect next question, actually. So for some people, when they first hear what I just said, they scratch their head and they're kind of puzzled. Well, what do you mean, unique ecological niche? Like, you got an example of that? And no, not literally. Ecological niches are virtually impossible to put into language, to describe with language, because an ecological niche is the set of all the relationships any creature has with everything else in their ecosystem or in their world more generally. And that's pretty much impossible to describe. So for other than humans, they don't need a description. They're born with it, and they never that knowledge, and they never lose that knowledge. But for humans, we forget. Soon after we're born, or maybe in the first couple of years, we forget that knowledge we were born with and that place we were born to take in the world. And so when we later in life, if we're fortunate enough to reach the stage of life in which we go through the journey of soul initiation, then if it goes well, we'll have one or more what experiences I call soul encounters. An encounter with this mystical, unique ecological niche we were born to take. But the way that appears to our consciousness is in terms of metaphor, that we understand it like as if it's a poem, or if it's an image or a symbol or an archetype or like a dream-like sequence, which is to say that we come to understand our unique ecological niche, which is our soul, mythopoetically, like the way we experience a myth or a poem or a dream. So for those of you anyone who's read any of my books, one thing you know about me is that my first soul encounter when I was 30, which happened to be on a vision fast, my first fast, I was, without going into the whole story right now, I was shown, or actually told by a butterfly, that what I was born to do in this life had something to do with weaving cocoons. Okay, there was the metaphor for me, weaving cocoons. I had no idea what it meant when I was told that. I'm still learning what it means 40 years later. But that's an example of a mythopoetic identity. Another quick example, Joanna Macy, the Earth Elder, one of my elders, a true elder, which is rare these days. She had 3 soul encounters, but one of them was that her work in the world was to be one stone in a bridge between the thought world of the East, the Orient, and the thought world of the West. And in many ways, that's what she has done and is doing in her life. Carl Jung had 2 soul encounters, in my understanding, and one of them had to do, showed him that he was to introduce to people the reality of what he called the self as the center of the human psyche. And that was his mythopoetic identity, or part of it. So there's a few examples.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, this will probably be the last question, Bill, before we move into more of the interpersonal and the wider our story, right?
Okay.
But would you say the book is kind of like a self-help book where if person purchases the book and goes through it, it's something that these activities they could do, they could find their own mythopoetic identity on their own? Or is it something that they need to, you know, like go into a retreat and do, or I guess, will the book guide them to find it that way? Is that the idea of the book?
That is the idea of the book. Of course, I really dislike the label self-help because so many self-help books are, I think, relatively superficial and not deeply helpful. But yes, I call it a field guide, and it is intended to provide a map of the journey of soul initiation. And it's actually, you might say it does 2 things simultaneously, although I don't know if I actually said this in the book. One thing, it provides what I call a deep structure of the journey of soul initiation. It's, in other words, it's my best mapping that I can do of the fundamental patterns of the journey of soul initiation that we find in other cultures around the world, and that I would expect we'd find in all cultures if we had a chance to explore it that way. But the second thing it's doing is it's providing a specific version of that deep structure, of that more generic sense of the journey of soul initiation. And in particular, the book is offering a nature-based, contemporary, Western version of the journey of soul initiation. So this is not borrowed from any indigenous traditions or any other traditions. There are some universal features of our version of the journey that you find in most all cultures, but generally how we discovered to do this is through 40 years of guiding tens of thousands of people and noticing what their psyches wanted them to experience. So you might say, what are the mysteries of this journey? Or if this journey is something we could actually call a human archetype. It's something that all humans are designed to go through. Then if we just observe carefully, take really careful field notes, we'll start seeing the patterns of how this journey of initiation unfolds. And that's what we did. And that's what is in the book. And with a lot of stories of real humans, real everyday humans who went through this experience, many of which I've guided, but some of them, of course, I didn't guide at all. And like Carl Jung, for example, and there's at least one good indigenous example in there. So it looks like, yeah, this is a cross-cultural pattern that every culture finds its own way to embody. Oh, sorry, I should say, I just remembered your question, and I should say some other aspects of it. So yes, this book will help someone who's going through this journey. It also helps someone prepare to start the journey because, again, as I implied before, our culture either ignores or obstructs this journey. And so most contemporary humans have a lot of psychological and spiritual preparation to do before the journey will really start. And so the book goes into that in quite amount of detail. The last piece of your question I should say something about is you don't actually have to have a guide, a human guide, an in-fleshed human guide to support you through this. I just believe that it's likely to go more efficiently and more successfully and deeper if you have a guide who knows something about the terrain. but the book itself would help. And I know lots of people who've gone through the experience who had no idea what was going on. They didn't have any book or any outer guide. But one kind of guide that everybody has is an inner guide. We all have inner guides. Carl Jung had no outer guide. He had not the slightest clue what was going on for him when he was in his late 30s, going through what is now known as the Red Book experiences that Carl referred to as his confrontation with the unconscious. But he had these inner imaginal guides who were absolutely brilliant, independent of his ego completely, knew all kinds of stuff that there was nothing in his background that would have given him that kind of knowledge. Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Thanks. Bill, you want me to take it? Okay. So now we'll move into the interpersonal side, that our story side, the bigger story, I guess the collective story. So this first one says, you say in the book that you believe that the root cause of all the dire crisis and challenges of our time is a widespread failure in individual human development. So how so is that the case? That's the crisis of our time.
Yeah. Well, one way is to connect the dots to what I was saying earlier, that I believe that most contemporary people in conformist consumer societies stuck in early adolescence and often a not healthy version thereof. So yeah, widespread arrested human development. It's kind of tragic, and to consider the possibility that for hundreds and probably actually thousands of years, especially in the Western world, we have lost not only the initiation processes that get us from adolescence to adulthood, but the initiation processes and more generally the ways to support the development, the psychospiritual development of children, such that even the childhood of most contemporary people alive now is not a healthy childhood. And when I look around at the enormous number and seriousness of crises that we have in the world that are social, political, ecological, spiritual, and so on, one thing has become just so clear to me, and I don't think this is a radical thing to say actually, is that mature humans don't act this way. Mature societies don't have political systems like we have here in the West. Mature societies don't have the kind of religious organizations and the immaturity of those religious organizations and many of the religious professionals that we have. Mature societies don't have the majority of people not experiencing a deep belonging to the social world and to the more than human world, don't have rampant addictions and suicide and on and on and on. This is not what a mature human is like. And one thing we can get into maybe later if you want to, it's a whole story though, is how this might have come about. How did we lose our ways of supporting children and adolescents to develop emotionally? How did we lose the initiation processes? And by the way, I don't mean just the rites of passage. That's bad enough to lose those. But I'm talking about something much, much bigger and more extensive than the rites of passage, namely the stages of life. Between those passages, the stages of life are much, much longer, much greater percentage of our development than the passages themselves. How did we lose our ecocentric and soul-centric understanding of the stages of life and how to support children and teens to progress through those stages? Yeah.
Maybe, Bill, if I could, does the book mention anything about the machine, the technology now? I mean, the algorithms that are being created by humanity. It seems like they're starting to raise children in a way, and they're obviously polarizing humanity. Does it say anything about that, or is it mostly the counter to that is to get into nature, to get away from the machine? Is that the idea?
Well, maybe I'm not absolutely certain what you mean by the machine, but like technology more generally. Yeah. Technology itself is not a problem. It's how it's being used. Yeah, I agree with you. What you're saying, that it's our disconnect from, our separation from, our alienation, our exile from the larger Earth community, and our experienced belonging and love affair with the larger world, that the loss of that is very, very deeply significant. And in any future human society that is healthy, it's not so much that we'll go back to our relationship with the greater world or the natural world. It's just that we'll never lose that, because children are born with that. We're all born with that. And then we lose it. And we have to regain that somatic, emotional experience of belonging to the greater Earth community. And unless we have that rootedness, or if either we never lose it or we regain it at some point, that sense of rootedness in the greater Earth community, unless we have that, there's a kind of anxiety or restlessness at the very core of our experience of ourself in the world. And we could have the tightest social circle imaginable. We can be held in esteem by our friends and our family, and we can have the most loving, beautiful, romantic relationship, but we're still going to have a certain sense of anxiety and restlessness at our core if we don't experience our everyday, our rootedness in this greater unfolding, magical, enchanted story of the greater Earth community.
Bill, if someone's listening to us right now and they're feeling a sense of urgency that this is a path I want to go on, or maybe on already, but you would describe in your book the descent into the soul canyon and experience of the cocoon. And for those people that don't know what goes on in a cocoon, the caterpillar dissolves. And what do you say to people who say, you know, I have a family, I have bills to pay, I have obligations, I can't let my whole life as I know it dissolve? What would you say to somebody like that?
You're not ready for the experience. That's okay. That's not a criticism. That a person who's ready for the descent to soul, which by the way is the primary subject matter of this new book, a person who's psychospiritually ready for it, there's nothing that would keep them from it. There would be a lot of logistical things to work out, perhaps, especially in the contemporary Western world, but their longing is so deep that there is nothing that would be more important for them. So someone who says what you just said, that, you know, I got all these obligations, I can't do this, I'd say, that's okay. You're not ready yet. That when you're ready, you won't be saying that, trust me. Part of the way to understand this, a little more detail, is this difference between early adolescence and late adolescence. Very different stages. Again, late adolescence is the one that maybe only 20% of contemporary Western people, even Eastern, I mean, anywhere in the world in contemporary societies ever reach. And I call, a little bit more colorfully, I call early adolescence the oasis. That's the healthy version of early adolescence. The unhealthy, one of the terms is conforming and rebelling. But late adolescence, that's what I call the cocoon. And people in early adolescence who are exposed to or read about the journey of soul initiation in any of my books or anywhere else, will say, well, I don't know about that. It kind of sounds interesting, but are you kidding? I can't drop everything and do that. And that would be the right perspective to take, because attempting to go through the descent when you're in the oasis, it's not going to work anyways. So how people might wonder, well, how do you get from the oasis to the cocoon? And the answer is you address the developmental tasks of the oasis. That's how anybody makes progress through a stage of life in the model that's in my book, Nature and the Human Soul. I call it the soul-centric developmental wheel. You address the tasks of that stage. And the task of the oasis is to cultivate a social presence that is both authentic and socially accepted by your peer group. I don't know if that sounds easy to people who are listening, but it turns out it's challenging. And in the contemporary world, it's really, really difficult because of developmental failures during childhood that bring us into early adolescence without all the kind of resources we need in order to cultivate our personal authenticity. Authenticity is also challenging for so many people in the world today because we live in conformist societies where it's all about looking good. So the emphasis is put on social acceptance and not so much on personal authenticity. I simply mean by that knowing what our true values are, what our interests are, what our emotions are, what our emotions tell us, how to assimilate our emotions, how to express them, so on. A lot of people don't know how to access this authenticity. So that's the task of early adolescence. Once we create a social presence, a way of being in the world in terms of our relationship to other humans and maybe a job or in our family life and so on, then mystery kind of grabs us by the scruff of the neck and throws us out of the oasis into the cocoon. And once you're in the cocoon, before too long, you're going to have such a deep longing to dive into the mysteries of your own soul, your own psyche, that you will end up finding a way to arrange things in your life that you can go on that journey. And if you're married with kids, if it's the full catastrophe, it's going to be more challenging for you. But having guided people through this kind of journey for 40 years, I can say, yeah, everybody I know has found a way to do it. Those who can leave the everyday social life, go deeper and faster, but those who can't, they still, with some guidance, they find a way to be in the everyday world, but not of it. And there's all kinds of techniques for doing that.
Thank you. What does it say to you about our species that we've become so destructive of both other species and our own and the environment that supports us all?
Yeah, we've lost our way. Another way to say it is that maybe we're a relatively young species. A lot of people have said that. And so maybe we're just relatively early in the process of learning how to be human. We were given a power by evolution, some people would say by God or by the mystery. We were given a power that, as far as we know, no other species has. If any other species has it, they've done a better job than we have. And we know that because we're the only species that is destroying life on this planet. Because all life is designed not only to be life-sustaining, but actually life-enhancing. Everything gives away. Every species, every individual is designed or born to give away their gift to the rest of life and to actually enhance life and further diversify it. Okay, so as I was just saying, one thing this might tell us about our species is that we're relatively young and we're just learning how to use this special power we've been given. Have I named the power yet? It's the power of our mode of consciousness, that we have this conscious self-awareness, which provides us with what we call an ego. By ego, again, I simply mean this capacity to be aware of ourselves. And because we have this mode of consciousness, we have this capacity to understand, among other things, to understand that we live in a universe. As far as we know, other kinds of species don't know we live in a universe. And we're also able, as my partner Janine Marie Haugen reminds us regularly, we have the ability to imagine the future. Another way to say this is that we have the ability to consciously cooperate with evolution. That's an amazing power. And like any kind of power, we can use it against ourselves in the rest of life. And so far, that's what we've been doing. So much more I could say about, again, how that, an understanding of how we got to this place and how it started many thousands of years ago. And we in the Western world, by the way, did not solely invent egocentric, life-destroying cultures. That we see in the anthropological record that this has happened all over the world. That human cultures have a tendency to go bad. Not all of them, but some of them. And it's a little bit worse than that, than when a culture becomes egocentric, it tends to, it's because of a kind of unnatural greed and a kind of capacity for violence we don't see anywhere else in the Earth community. And when that happens to a given society or tribe, they infect and ruin the neighbor tribes because they're going to hoard as much stuff and other humans, which is, say, enslavement, that they can. And that ruins that neighbor culture. And then now you have a bunch of cultures or tribes or societies that are ruining the ones around them. And that whole process continues until we reach what we call the 21st century, when we've destroyed almost all of the healthy cultures on the planet. Okay, so your question was, what does this say about us? I don't think it says we're evil at all. I'd say it tells us we're a relatively young species that's just still working out what it is to be human and how to wield this extraordinary power, this gift that we've been given. And it's kind of like an early adolescent human where that's been given a weapon or a very powerful tool, we're misusing it. And we're at this kind of crux point in our own evolution that we're either going to figure it out, work it out soon, or we're going to continue destroying much of the rest of the life on this planet and possibly our own species.
Yeah.
Another last way to say that is that we're in this initiation process ourselves as a species. And because of that, the whole planet is on an initiatory journey. And the way I've come to think about this is that every planet in the universe that evolves a form of life like ours that has the kind of consciousness that we have reaches, every planet that has a human-like conscious self-aware species reaches, it's inevitable that we reach this exact dilemma, this conflict, this catastrophe, this initiation crux point. And so I've made up a story that some planets get through it and some don't. Just like with individual initiation, that I'm talking about the initiation into true adulthood, because there's lots of initiations in life, that some initiates make it and survive and some don't. We don't know if we and our planet will or not.
You say that at this point in time, our collective journey requires a radical shift in the human relationship with the community of all of life. Can you explain more about that, what you mean by that?
Yeah, and
what needs to happen for this to become a reality?
Yeah, there's so many brilliant and much more poetic people, writers, speakers who've been saying this for so long. And it's the process of remembering that we are one species among millions on this planet. We are not more important than any other species. We're special, but every species is special. We have our form of intelligence, but every species has its form of intelligence. Every other species has forms of intelligence that go way beyond what humans could possibly do. And we have our form of intelligence, especially our form of imagination, which is probably the most important kind of intelligence we have. So yeah, we have to go. One way I say it in at least two of my books is that how are we going to get there? Is that we have to go through a major life passage. Each individual has to go through, in the Western world, in the contemporary world, has to go through a major life passage I call ecological awakening. In a healthy culture, no one ever goes through that passage because no one needs to. That no one ever, as I was saying before, in a healthy culture, every child is supported to explore and cultivate their relationship with the more than human world, with the world outside the perimeter of the village. But in the contemporary dominator or egocentric dominator cultures, industrialized cultures, most all children, by the time they're halfway through childhood, they've lost that innate connection. And then they get into early adolescence without that connection. And so the way to get back, to sink our roots back into the wider Earth community is this process at Animus we call ecological awakening or eco-awakening. And it's something that happens for a very large percentage of people on our Animus immersions, regardless of the nature of the actual immersion. When people show up who haven't gone through eco-awakening yet, they often do that on their first program with us. And they'll say things like, until this week, I never knew that there was something like an invisible curtain or shield between me and the rest of the world. And I didn't know it was there until it shattered, until it dropped. And then I had this experience that some people might put it into words by saying things like, I had this somatic experience that I was as natural and wild as that tree or that mountain or that river or that cloud, that everything is my kin. I'm related to everything. And this, it's not an intellectual experience. It's a somatic one. It's an experience of coming home. It's an experience of realizing I have been exiled my entire life and now finally I'm home. This is ecological awakening. And that is a relatively easy experience to bring about compared to soul initiation, which for most people, it takes at least a few years, and for many it takes several years. And for those who don't have a map of the journey or an outer human guide, it can take a couple decades or more. For Carl Jung, it took him 18 years. He was in the cocoon. But one doesn't get to the cocoon until one goes through ecological awakening. And that passage, ecological awakening, is the passage from that unhealthy, egocentric early adolescence to the healthy early adolescence of the oasis. That's the big shift that gets us into the oasis.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so maybe what we'll do is we have a couple of questions, Bill, just on the bigger story now, right? So one of the things that I found with Illuman is, compared to other men's groups, is that men seem to come to Illuman for the spiritual side of it. Some of the other men's groups really don't offer them that. And that's one of the reasons why they come to Illuman. So, this whole idea of transcending, nature and ourselves, and there's something bigger out there. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time just talking about that, or Or maybe the answer is if you do go out in nature and find your soul, and in essence, you'll find the whole picture in the end. Maybe that's the idea, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. So question is, we're in a time of severe, even existential crisis, both culturally and environmentally. Do you have any hope that we'll get through this without a catastrophic loss of biodiversity, without global nuclear holocaust, without going extinct ourselves? If so, what inspires this hope?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if by hope you mean, as many people do, maybe most people do, something like predictability. Like, would I predict we're going to get through this without destroying the Earth systems to such a degree that our own species is not well supported anymore by the Earth community and maybe possibly resulting in our own extinction? Do I predict we will? I don't know. I honestly don't. I could definitely see it could go either way. There's so many inspiring visionaries in the world now, and visionary organizations that are working on all kinds of dimensions to turn things around. But who knows if they/we will be successful. These organizations and individuals are creating the infrastructure for a sustainable society, which is just the foundation to ultimately get to a truly healthy society, which is not sustainable, but life enhancing. There are some organizations who are engaged in what can be called culture interruption, who are trying to actually undermine the industrial growth system that's destroying this life on this planet. Cultural interrupters, trying to get civilization to collapse as soon as possible because it's what is destroying life. And maybe most importantly, there are really inspirational organizations and individuals who are trying to save as much life of as many species as possible while what we call civilization collapses. So my prediction, I really don't know. But I want to take another approach to the word hope, which I've learned from various people like Rebecca Solnit, the author, brilliant author, and Václav Havel, who's written about hope, and Joanna Macy. Those are three people who've written beautiful things about hope. And I have a perspective on hope that's resonant with theirs, but somewhat unique as well. And here it is. First it's reminding me of something Václav Havel says, which is that hope comes from inside. He might have even said that hope comes from the soul. But here's my version of it. I believe that every living thing on this planet is born with the knowledge of what place it is meant to take in the greater web of life. Some traditions call this original instructions. Every species, the individual of every species, is born with this original instructions, this knowledge, and we're no exception. And I call that the soul, a unique ecological niche that we're born for that and with that knowledge. But we forget in childhood, and then it's in late adolescence, in the cocoon, we go into an initiation process to remember, not to figure it out, but to remember what we were born knowing and had forgotten. So if that's true, the hope that we have is every single one of us. I mean, I just hope I can connect these dots for you, that if each one of us was born to take a particular place in the world, and whatever creates us knows what kind of world we're in right now, you could say, yes, it is literally true. We were born for these times, every single one of us, because we were born to take a particular place in this earth, which at this time is one that is undermining the diversity of life because of our particular species. So each one of us is born to make a difference. Now, here's the rub, or here's the catch, that we're not able to embody that unique place we were born to take unless we go through some kind of initiatory process to rediscover that. And not just, see, when we have a soul encounter, it's not just information. It's like, okay, Bill, you are to weave cocoons. Got it. Okay, thank you very much. Got the download. I'll get busy. I'll get right on it starting Thursday. That's not the way it works. It's you have this mystical experience, this soul encounter, and then by giving yourself to that experience, the soul itself, or you could say mystery, starts shape-shifting us, not physically, but our egos. It shape-shifts. In my case, it started the work, mystery or soul, started the work of shape-shifting me from Bill, the psychologist, to cocoon weaver. And that doesn't happen in a day. In some ways, it's still going on 40 years later. And in the book, there's lots of examples of practices that help that metamorphosis happen. Okay, so you asked about hope. And my answer is the greatest hope, and it's not a prediction, but the greatest source of transformation is ourselves, our souls. And in order to embody and manifest that hope that we are born as, that's the best way to say it, that we're born as, we need to go through some kind of initiation process. I call it the journey of soul initiation. You don't have to come to Animas Valley Institute to do it. It is our specialty. But as I gave examples like Joanna, Macy, and Carl Jung, and also in the book, William Butler Yeats, and in some ways myself, our own psyches, or you could say, or the world too, are designed in such a way that if we get out of the way of the process, we'll go through this journey. But it's obstructed in so many ways. This, as I've been saying before, that probably around 80% never even get to the stage of life where the journey can happen. So, in some ways, my greatest hope for the world is that there'll be organizations in the next decade or two all over the world who are creating their own version of the journey of soul initiation that fits their people and their place on the planet. And that will enable more and more humans to become soul initiated and to carry as a gift to the world the precise gift that they were born to take at this time to get us through this extraordinarily difficult time in the world.
Yeah. What a beautiful hope it is, Bill. Yeah. And so, Bill, Brennan, I guess we have probably one more question, and then we'll probably have about 15 minutes. So for the men participating, if you want, you can raise your hand, use the reactions and raise your hand, and then I'll just call out, the names that I see in the participant list window. So the last question we had, Bill, you're our second watering hole guide here. Jim Finley for Father's Day in June was our first, and he's in the CAC. And this kind of gets to that transcending. Is there anything that transcends nature? When you listen to Jim, he uses the word infinity a lot, and you mentioned the word God, and you mentioned the word mystery. And in Illuman, there's always that sense of, since Richard was the founder, the sense of God and spirit. And Richard always talks about nature as being the first Bible. So does the book mention anything about, I think Bill Brennan said there's something about inscendence, right, Bill, instead of transcendence? How would you respond to the God question, I guess? And is there anything that transcends nature? Who our creator is, anything like that? Who created nature and stuff like that?
Well, thanks. I'll give you my answer, but it's not my specialty. In my particular view, no, there's nothing that transcends nature. Nature is, the natural world is as magical and mind-blowing and enchanted as anything could be. It doesn't need anything outside of it. I believe the notion that there is something outside of it is itself a problem. It's not a, it's a way of thinking that disconnects us from the world that we're part of. That said, there's a dimension or a feature or quality, how do we want to say it, of the world. See, we don't even have to say the natural world. I mean, it's just the world. There's a dimension or quality or feature of the world that I, and I know others, might call something like this vast imagination, this creative quality of the world. It's not separate from the world. It is an aspect of the world. It's a feature of the world. And this mysterious world is unfolding and is being supported to do so by something that is part of the world. I just don't see what the point of that transcendence piece would be. I think it's unnecessary. But people mean different things by that word, transcendence, just like the word adult or ego or soul. You can mean different kinds of things. So sometimes I use the word transcendence to say, well, transcending the ego. It's not outside of nature. It's just mystery is something, or God is something way, way, way bigger, obviously, infinitely bigger than the human ego. And you probably know that I feel there's these two halves of spirituality. One goes upward and the other goes downward. One is not better than the other. They are complementary. You need both parts of spirituality, the upper and the under. Going down is not going to hell. It's going towards the center, or for the human psyche, the soul. And so we can transcend the ego in two directions. We transcend when we merge with or have an experience of the divine, or as I would like to say, the vast imagination. And and that gets us beyond the ego. That's a kind of transcendence. It's a kind of spiritual experience. And we also transcend the ego when we go downward to soul, which is an identity that's much, much deeper and very different categorically from our egos. But one of my teachers, Thomas Berry, the monk, the theologian, he called himself a geologian because he was a nature-based, earth-oriented theologian. It's one of my favorite quotes. He says, what we need now, he said, we have to invent or reinvent healthy cultures, that there are no cultures on the planet. And he was a cultural historian, and he studied cultures in the Orient and the West, indigenous cultures all over the world. And he said, there are no cultures on the planet now that will allow us to solve the dilemma that we're in now. He said, we have to invent or reinvent a sustainable human culture by a descent into something like into our pre-rational, our instinctive resources, something like that. And he follows that with this sentence: what we need now is not transcendence, but inscendence. Okay, there's that word, inscendence. Thomas Berry coined it. I asked him, what do you mean by that? You never explained what you meant by inscendence. Well, you said it was a descent into our pre-rational instinctive resources. Elsewhere, he says it's an experience of dream. He said all kinds of things about it, but I asked him if he'd say more about it, and he said, I don't need to say more about it to you, Bill. It's what you're doing in your work. I said, got it. Okay, that's what you mean. So here's this Christian Catholic mystic who says, what we need now is not transcendence, but inscendence.
So,
Mm.
so Bill Brennan, I guess we're at the point, right? So Bill, that
Yep.
was great. And maybe we have 15 minutes, so we could open it up to some Q&A.
Appreciate it, Bill.
Yeah.
And yeah, any questions anybody has, raise your hand. If you don't know how to raise your hand, on the bottom of your screen as you draw down your mouse. There's a word reactions on the right. Just click on that. You can raise your hand and Anthony will recognize that.
Yep. Put the camera on. I guess Keith has something here in the chat, right? Is soul initiation connected to life timelines? Is it best to discover young, and can it be too late? You speak in Soulcraft about discovering this purpose, remembering it. Does this imply both a life before and a life after this one? Do you believe in life after where the purpose can continue?
I do think of things that way. I don't think anything ultimately rests on it, but that story works for me. The idea that we have a series of lifetimes, but what do we mean by we? Who has a series of lifetimes exactly? What if reincarnation, if anything like that is true, what gets reincarnated? It's an interesting question. Different traditions have different kinds of answers. I resonate with Buddhists who say there is no thing that gets reincarnated. There's no self that goes from one life to another. But say, now here's my unique, oddball, radical twist on these things. If the soul, if we understand that, as I do, to be a person's unique ecological niche, well, that's not something in me. It's not something in my psyche. It's definitely not something in my body. Because that's often, those are the ways we have to talk about soul. But if you use my definition of soul, then it's something that's outside of me. It's in the world. An ecological niche is a set of relationships in the world. It's a place. You might say it's sometimes we call it an ecological function in the world, a niche. Well, when a person dies, when a human dies, that niche is vacated, but it's still there. It's still in the world. And we can imagine the story in which we say, well, there'll be some other human born before too long who has the same or very similar niche, and they'll inhabit it. It's not the ego that goes from, in this story, from one life to another. There's nothing that goes from one life to another. But there's that ecological niche that was occupied by one person. And then after they die, some other human is born to occupy that place. And it's not that far-fetched to imagine this, that I might be able to have memories of earlier lifetimes that occupied the same niche that I do now. And maybe that's, how the way the new Dalai Lama is selected. I mean, before the Chinese got in the way of it. That's how they used to be. That the new Dalai Lama is not, it's not the same ego as the previous life. It's somebody who's occupying the same niche and can remember the lifetimes of others who occupied that same niche. Okay, so there's something to muse on for you.
Yeah. And we have a question from Bill, another Bill, a lot of Bills here tonight. And I think it actually kind of goes to this, what Jim Finley says. He says this, and maybe you can think about it. He says, death is not an annihilation, it's a consummation. So you seem to mention death as some kind of reincarnation, at least that's what I heard. But Bill's question here is, I think I have your definition of soul down, but I get confused sometimes when you use the word spirit. What do you mean by spirit?
Spirit, I just mean that that great mystery. That's a feature of the world, that vast imagination. It's the whole. Spirit to me really refers to the whole universe, and including its vast imagination aspect. And everything in the universe is, you might say, an agent for spirit or an agent for mystery. But it's through its soul that it's an agent. So in the human case, we could say the mature ego, which is, say, the initiated ego, soul-initiated ego, is an agent for the soul that it's associated with, which is to say its unique ecological niche. And each soul is an agent for mystery, an agent to do what? To enhance life. That's what the universe has been doing, as far as we know, and we know a lot about it now. That, like on this planet, for sure, life keeps getting more complex and more diversified. So spirit is the whole. Soul is our individual, is a thing's individual place. And then in the case of humans, we got this strange third part, the ego, which is meant to be initiated to become an agent for soul, which is an agent for spirit. Hope that helps.
Yeah. All right. Does anybody else have a question? I don't see anything.
I have a quick question. I happen to have Carl Jung's Red Book here.
Yeah,
This is
big
what
book.
it looks like, gang, for anybody who's not seen it. And in it, he's got mandalas and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I don't know how the man did this pre-computer, but he did. And it's written in English, and what looks like calligraphy, but it's German, I believe, or Latin, one or the other. I think it's German.
It's German.
And you have a different view from most Jungian scholars. Can you share that with us briefly?
Yeah, thanks. I spent the last 6 or 7 years with the Red Book, and studying it really carefully, annotating, taking notes in the margins, and asking what is going on here. And I was puzzled for a long time, but then the pattern became clear, which doesn't in any way prove I'm right, but it just got clear to me. The Red Book is, you might say, it's Carl Jung's redoing of his journals, which he called and are known as the Black Books, that he kept when he was having what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. And he was being brought down into the depths. And it was his descent to soul, his first descent to soul. And again, he didn't have a guide, outer guide, but he had inner guides. And his primary technique for the descent was the use of his deep imagination, which he called active imagination. It's that and a little bit of dream work and a little bit of time on the land in his backyard. Those were pretty much his techniques, and some expressive art, what we would call expressive arts now. Whereas at Animus, we've been discovering what kind of techniques people use around the world, and also in the Western world. And there's about 30, 40, 50 different kind of practices. Carl had 2 or 3. And so he kept his Black Books are these journals of his encounters through his deep imagination with his own, what he called his unconscious, with his depths. And then he spent something like 15 additional years copying pretty much word for word what he had in his Black Books into this large folio size Red Book that you just showed us there, Bill. And but with each of his deep imagination journeys, there were about 33 of them. He added these long commentaries that were about as long as the descriptions of the experiences themselves. Okay, that's what's in the Red Book. The original Black Book journal entries, and then all these commentaries that over the next 15 years he elaborated. He gave his opinion, you might say, about what happened for him. And plus all these mandalas and other paintings in there. And it's absolutely gorgeous work of art. But Jungians, who I've read about the Red Book, tend to say what Carl Jung was doing is he was creating this new psychology, which ended up being called analytic psychology by him, and since then Jungian psychology, and it has all kinds of offshoots. But I say, no, no, no. He was not consciously trying to create anything. He was hanging on white-knuckled on this ride of his life that he wondered if he would survive. And he was being taken for a ride. He was not intending to create anything. He was being taken for a ride. And that's not my interpretation. It's what he tells us very clearly in both the Red Book and in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. No and there, but and a little bit more specifically, my new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, is actually, I might have mentioned already, it's primarily about the descent to soul, which is the core spiritual experience that takes place during the larger journey of soul initiation. The soul initiation journey is typically 4 to 5 years as a minimum, could be 20 years or more, depending on whether you have guidance. And any given descent to soul can be anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple years or more. So what I read in the Red Book, my reading of it, is that it's primarily his deeper psyche, let's just use that generic phrase, leading him through experiences that are actually the preparation phase for the descent. They're helping him cultivate his wholeness. There are these aspects of his own psyche that are guiding him through these harrowing, often harrowing experiences that result in his cultivating what I call the 4 facets of human wholeness. And the second thing that I'm reading in the Red Book is these are dissolution experiences. That's the second of the 5 phases of the descent to soul, where you're actually falling down into the depths. And that's an image he used himself, that every night he would go into his study and close the door, and because he was at home during this time, and he was seeing patients during the day, and he has 5 kids at home, maids and so forth, and of course his wife Emma, and he would close the door at night and he would plummet in his imagination, and there would be this entirely new, you could never make it up, he couldn't have made it up himself experience, interacting with all kinds of remarkable beings and remarkable places. Some of the beings were biblical, some were not. Like the first 3 or 4 involve Elijah from the Bible and Salome and the serpent. And so the first 2 things going on in the Red Book in my framework is holding, which is cultivating his wholeness, which he needs in order to actually go down into the depths for soul encounter. And the second is it's the dissolution of his early adolescent ego. He's being dismembered, shredded, everything he believed about medicine, psychiatry, religion, being a man, being a woman, being a human. Everything is just completely shredded, and he's being taught a completely different perspective. This is dissolution. And then the third thing that happens, it's almost at the very end of the Red Book, is he has his first soul encounter. And for those of you who've read his memoir or the Red Book, that first soul encounter happened when he was at home in the afternoon one day, I think it was a Sunday, and in his imagination, a horde of dead people came to his house, started violently ringing his doorbell, which was a mechanical doorbell, not an electric one. He saw the doorbell moving outside through his window, and he said the dead had come to him after their journey to Jerusalem, where they did not find what they had been seeking, and they had questions for Carl Jung about what is it to be human? What is God? Is God dead? Etc. They had some great questions. And then what Carl discovered is that some answers were coming through him. It was not his ego coming up with any answers, but they just started emerging through him. And he took it as dictation. And for several nights, he just wrote these things out. And he called them the 7 sermons to the dead. And the way it was a soul encounter is that it placed him, his ego, in the position in relationship to the dead that he was born to take. So I mentioned his second soul encounter earlier in this hour, but his first one was this one, in which he was actually placed in the position to represent the dead for the rest of humanity in a way that the dead were not getting represented, at least in the Western world, and to understand the relationship between the dead and the unconscious. That's a big piece of who Carl Jung was born to be. And he discovered it by mystery, grabbing him by the neck and shoving him into that place. And he said if he had resisted the dead when they came to his house, he would have gone crazy and not have survived. But as soon as he said, yes, I will meet with the dead, then everything started flowing. Okay, that's just a little piece of my understanding of the Red Book.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And Bill, the time went so fast. It was a pleasure. And so I want to thank for all the men that participated tonight. This was our second Watering Hole event. Our next one is being planned for June for Father's Month. In the meantime, we have many virtual offerings, including the virtual council. So you just have to go to the Illuman website and you can find them, or Animas Valley's website, and you could find what Bill was mentioning about his outdoor time to help find your soul. So Bill, we'd like to close with a poem from a poet that has become the signature for Illuman. I'm sure you'll know it. The small man builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to tuck his head when the moon is low, keeps dropping keys all night long for the beautiful rowdy prisoners. So Bill, thanks for dropping so many keys for us. And especially thank you for donating your stipend back to Illuman. That was pretty nice when I heard that. And for your continued guidance and leadership, for helping us live into our Illuman mission, which is men transforming men. The loving spirit of Mother Earth is alive and well in you. And thank you for inspiring us. So thank you. Bill Brennan, anything, or Bill Plotkin before we go?
We
Just to
usually
thank
say
you.
ho, but I think your word is way.
We like to say
way.
way. We just
Thank
don't want
you.
to sound like Native Americans, so we say way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Way.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great
Thanks,
pleasure.
Bill. Yeah.
Oh.
So go out and get